Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, this is like my classes, so I'm going to make you do it just like I do with my courses. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Wonderful. It's great to see you all here. And this is a real honor, and particularly timely, because I've got to tell you that in the last week, I've had so many epiphanies on my research work that everything is new and bright and flashing in my brain. And so even when I was walking my dog this morning, I had some thoughts that I just had to add in here. And so we're going to start with those because a couple of the opportunities I've had over the last week have exposed me and my engineering work, and remember I am an engineer, have exposed me to the other side of the thought process involved in my own research and learning about the social sciences and the humanities. And I came out of that just ecstatically excited about how things tie together. And one of the big revelations I had was breaking news, and yeah, I stole that from the news. All knowledge is incomplete. And you know, it's easy to say, well, duh, of course all knowledge is incomplete. But all of us who work particularly in professional areas that have a very defined expertise, we tend to think that everything we know is everything that needs to be known. And I was reminded over and over this week of how the interrelationships in multiple knowledges are so critical to finding, and I use the term a little cautiously, to finding truth. I'm going to give you one quick example because I was talking with our medical school students on Tuesday night, and one of my colleagues from the social sciences was describing how there's research out there that shows that a medical student who takes an art history course develops a power of observation that's not seen without studying art history. And so this leads to another breaking news revelation. My art history degree actually has an actual practical value. And that's very exciting to me. But I do want to talk with you about the concept of contextual engineering. And that's what I'm here today to discuss with you. Before I start, though, I'd like to lay some ground rules and set some definitions. And hopefully these will make sense. When somebody like myself is trained in development engineering, working in societies that are called developing societies, we create through those words a particular relationship. And that relationship is very problematic, and so I've abandoned the notion of development and developed and developing. And instead, I tend to refer to the society from which I come as an industrialized society. And the societies that I work with, I like to think of as alternately developed, because that takes out the loading of, well, they haven't reached where I am yet. Instead, they're going down a different path, and I respect that, and that's important. Another term that I want to reframe is beneficiary. I've been in my research going through my old travel journals from 10, 15 years ago, before I knew I would be in academia, let alone in research. And I found myself referring to the natives and the locals and the beneficiaries. And I read that now and cringe and say, oh my goodness, I can't believe that those were the terms that I was routinely using. Because beneficiaries aren't the people necessarily who receive the infrastructure intervention that I'm working on. In fact, all stakeholders, all people involved in an international engineering project are beneficiaries. There's significant research that shows, in fact, that the people who benefit the most from doing an engineering project somewhere else in the world are the funding sources, because they're able to demonstrate a success that propagates additional funds, which demonstrates additional successes, which keeps them in work for a long time. And so if you think about the fact that everybody who's working on a project is a beneficiary, you stop referring to the client, which is the next item here. The client, or the population that's receiving the engineering work, as benefiting from it. They're an equal partner, and in fact, they're in charge. So when I'm working with communities, this year I'm teaching courses in Honduras and Guatemala, And very early on, we set the rules for our students that these are our clients and we're consulting for them. It's not our project. We're never allowed to call it our project. And I've adopted kind of the same attitude that I had when I was a working professional engineer in the United States. Can you imagine if I went to Champaign and said to them, I will work with you on your stormwater system design, but only if you promise me that 50% of your city council will be women? Do you think I'd be hired? And yet we put this sort of burden on ourselves whenever we're working internationally, because we feel that rather than working for another society, we're working to help them, to develop them, to get them more aligned with our own understanding of the world. That leads to this next item on my definitions, the difference between engineering and poverty intervention. We have been conditioned, both by funding sources and by our own experiences, to believe that it's critically important that every engineering effort also relieve poverty, improve what we consider important values, many of which I do feel are very important. But when I put a responsibility, for example, on my engineering to provide additional access or additional economic opportunity for women, as much as I consider that a significant thing, it can really skew the engineering result. And so I've come to the conclusion that in contextual engineering, I have to lay aside my own values, my own expectations, my own identity, and work with my client's values and identity. This isn't to say that I have to accept everything. It just means that my engineering has to be informed by the people I'm working for. The final item that I just want to discuss here, and I won't talk on every slide this long, I promise, but this is important. We are accustomed to looking for the grand solution, the silver bullet. Engineers particularly are prone to believing that if we just find the right technology for the whole world, all of our problems will be solved. The reality is everybody's different. Every population is different. Every society is different. And there is no scalability. And it's an unfortunate realization that I came to because, like so many of my fellow engineers, I wanted to believe that if I just found the golden key, I could make an impact. Instead, I've come to the conclusion that the golden key is recognizing that there is no golden key. Does that make sense? So let's talk a little bit about the problem that exists with development engineering. And I'm using that term. You'll find I use the word development. I'm not using it derisively, but I am using it in terms of a traditional approach rather than my own. Development engineering is what we've been doing for the last 50 years. It's the industrialized world going out into other places and providing a glimpse of our own lives through engineering infrastructure. What you find when you look at this is that the first driver is the money, because everything costs money, and you need money, and you can't do work if you can't afford getting materials and labor and all the things and the technology. The problem with money is, as I mentioned before, with the beneficiary funding organizations, they want to demonstrate impact, and they want to demonstrate large impact, and so their money is going to go where they can optimize their impact. That tends to be to urban areas, and it tends to be to areas where they can reach the most people for the least infrastructure. I'm not criticizing that. I understand why that is, but it's creating a situation where the rural areas are getting left behind. Now, the engineers tend to be a part of this too, and please, I do want to keep reiterating that I'm talking about engineering with development. I'm not talking about development as a whole. There are policymakers, development experts who are doing completely different things, and I'm not even touching that because I don't know that, because that's not my area. I'm just interested in the decision-making that engineers use when they're working on development engineering. And what I've seen and and honestly what I've done in my early experience before I reached this awareness, is that engineers think we know everything. Are there any engineers in here, by the way? Holy cow, okay. So I will apologize to you now for any stereotypes I use in engineering, because I tend to use that because non-engineers relate. But we as engineers tend to believe we have the answers. We are well educated on technical knowledge. We know physical behaviors, physical structures, and as a result, we tend to think that we have all the answers. Would other engineers agree to some degree with me on that? Okay, I see a few nods. Yeah. The problem with that is the decisions that we're making neglect to recognize that there might be knowledge out there that we're not privy to. It's not necessarily a more advanced knowledge, kind of like the idea of an alternately developed society. It's a different knowledge. And it may be more appropriate for a client to use their knowledge than our own. I've had some engineers say, well, that's kind of a lazy way of engineering, because then you're just using, simple stuff and wiring things together, and it's not as robust and as great of a solution. I propose that it's actually a much more challenging and more technically important engineering, because you have to think to fit your knowledge with someone else's and learn from someone else to meet their needs. The outcome. So what happens when the funding sources work in urban areas and the engineers work from their own knowledge, their own value system? What you end up with is an increasing focus on urban areas, more migration from rural areas to cities, less support for rural areas, a greater difference between those living in the country and those living in the city, economically, socially, even in terms of perception of worth. Along with that goes less agricultural production, and ultimately a decrease in food security for countries because they're not able to produce their own foods. On top of this, we're also losing knowledge. We're relatively comfortable ecologically recognizing the importance of biodiversity, but we're not so comfortable recognizing the importance of cultural diversity. And the knowledge that we're losing by allowing rural areas to kind of slide off the map could be critical to future survival. What happens in addition to that diversity of knowledge is tastes, values, and traditions are abandoned. And people are left feeling somewhat bereft if their identity is devalued. So a couple of factors that feed into this development engineering cycle that I just showed you. Scalability equals bang for the buck. So one of the reasons that we're looking to be able to scale our solutions in engineering is because it's cheaper to have a solution and distribute it everywhere than it is to find a solution for each place. There's an insulation of engineers from recognizing that our knowledge base may not be the only knowledge base and that maybe we could learn from others. It's kind of curious, but I will admit that when I was working as an engineer in the United States, subject to all of the regulations that are here for water, I actually got a lot of ideas from working in Guatemala and the Dominican Republic that I learned from people there by their innovation that actually could be adapted and appropriated and used in the United States. And I think it made me a much stronger engineer in the United States as a result. This notion of rural inequality and power deficiency, I think, is a very important one, and I don't want to underestimate the impact this could have globally if we continue to allow our rural societies to be the leave-behinds. If we continue to focus on information technology, connecting the world's cities so that the rural areas aren't connected, the lack of respect for the notion of rural knowledge. These are all very important, and they create a strong sense of irrelevance for a lot of the communities that I've worked with in the world. As I was going through my notes just yesterday, I came upon some notes from when I was working in Cameroon. And the people of Cameroon in this village where I was kept asking me, can you turn us into a little America? And I kept saying, why do you want that? And they saw it as their only way to stay connected with the world. This lack of local self-sufficiency actually creates a greater foreign dependency because rural areas produce food. They produce crops. That's where food supply for countries comes from. And when they're producing less, those countries have to import from other places. All of this comes back to the globalization project, which I won't spend too much time on today, but I urge you to look at the notion of globalization as more than just a development, but as a process that has actually allowed state boundaries to be broken down throughout the world, but at the same time created a tier system so that those who come from the most heavily industrialized countries are best able to meet the needs or create a need among the countries that aren't at the top tier. Rural versus urban. I need to discuss this a little bit because I am in ag and bioengineering after all. So I read a really interesting article just recently that was talking about how people perceive urban and rural residents throughout the world. And they used the terms urbane versus rustic to talk about this. And they were saying that there's a perception, whether it's true or not, that all the intellectuals of the world gravitate towards urban areas. They are the urbane. And as a result, a lot of research into knowledge that may lie in the rustic region is ignored. There's not a lot of research into the knowledge that lies in the rural areas. And it's actually because we're all subject to thinking of, the rubes of the country versus the sophisticates of the city. I know as much as I fight against it, I'm as guilty as anyone. I look at New York City and say, that's where the people who know how the world works live. Why do I think that? It's because we're all so accustomed to thinking of population centers as being more connected, more talking to each other, and therefore more intellectual. Another thing I want to bring up is food security. So we think of food security as simply growing food and having enough available. In fact, a lot of societies consider certain foods not foods, and things that we wouldn't consider food, they consider food. And so defining food security, again, is being done from us on the global mountains, saying food security is having enough corn, soybeans, meat, dairy, while people in certain locations below us may say food security doesn't mean that at all. I like fatty meats. I like dog. I like, whatever it is that this society eats. And we pass judgment on whether that's food security or not. The last thing is indigeneity and the development of technology by place. Okay, this one dawned on me when I was taking an eco-hydraulics course. For all you hydro people, you'll appreciate this. Taking an eco-hydraulics course last year, and we were looking at how fish species develop based on where they swim. So you've got the bottom-feeding fish in the ponds, and their mouths are turned a certain way, and their gills function a certain way, and they don't swim fast, they swim slowly. You got these river fish who have evolved into swimming quickly, grabbing things along the way. If you put a river fish in a pond, that river fish is not going to do all that well, and vice versa. The pond fish is probably going to become food for somebody else. So if we think about knowledge the same way, knowledge springs up based on the place where it originates. So a farmer in the Andes Mountains is going to develop a knowledge and a technology and an approach much different from a farmer in the plains of the United States. And yet the farmers of the US plains think we can educate these people on how to improve their productivity of crops based on our knowledge, rather than looking at what the other society is doing. I just want to show you a couple of quick examples of what I call innovative self-sufficiency. This is the indigenous knowledge that springs up by place. And this was one of my big light bulbs in the last week when I was thinking about this knowledge that I'm saying we need to preserve that belongs to others, what exactly is it? And I was looking back through my own experiences and my photographs, and I realized that the big one is that when you're in a place where you don't have access to as many products and goods, you innovate. And that is an incredible ability. What I'm showing right here was, I took that 3 weeks ago in Guatemala. I had traveled to India a few years ago and gone to a sugarcane factory. And it was big and beautiful and modern, and it had all kinds of gears and lights and valves and shut-off things and, safety equipment. This does exactly the same thing. So what happened was a farmer in Guatemala wanted to diversify his crops a little bit, and so he put in some sugarcane. To extract the juices from the cane, he needed to create a press. He didn't have one, so he cut some trees down, and he built this himself. And it functions every bit as well as a mechanical one that has wiring and lights and switches and everything. But he had that innovative self-sufficiency to say, I can't afford a mechanized design, and so I'm going to build something out of these trees. Even better, this is my personal favorite example of innovative self-sufficiency. 3 years ago, a group of us in my course had traveled to the community we were working with in Honduras. And we do that every year. We make sure our students understand exactly who they're working with. So we live in the community. So we were renting a kind of a hall, a community center, which was the equivalent of a large house. And it had one latrine outside. And 20 of us were sharing that one latrine. Well, one night, the latrine clogged. And a student came to me and said, we can't flush the latrine, it's starting to overflow. And I'm like, oh, we gotta get a plunger. So I'm looking around for a plunger, couldn't find a plunger. I called some other students, grad students in engineering, and we had some professionals. And we're all kind of standing around this trying to figure it out. And I'm like, oh, let's get a clothes hanger, but the trap under the toilet was much too sharp, couldn't get a clothes hanger through. Didn't know what to do. We finally decided to go to the next house and ask them for a plunger. So remember, this is 20 engineers in a room, don't know how to unplug this toilet without a plunger. So we go to the next house and we ask, do you have a plunger? And the guy's looking at us like we're crazy. He's like, oh, what, And I'm thinking I'm gonna have to get in this four-wheel drive and drive like 50 miles to find the equivalent of a Walmart so I can buy a plunger so that we have this toilet. The guy comes down, he looks at it, he kind of taps the pipe a little bit, thinks, and walks away, goes behind our house, and we hear him with his machete chopping down a tree. And we're like, oh, okay, I guess he's not gonna help us, and I'm starting to look for my keys. Comes back a couple seconds later with this stick, and looks, the property that we were on was surrounded by barbed wire to mark the boundaries of the property, and there was a burlap bag stuck in that. So he bends over, he's kind of looking through the garbage, and he grabs this burlap bag and wraps it on there. One of our students at the time was doing something with duct tape, so he asked, could I borrow your duct tape? Wraps it around there, walks into the toilet, goes, psh, psh, opens it right up. And I can tell you there were 20 very sheepish engineers standing there going, oh my God, and we didn't think we could solve this unless we went on a long drive to buy a particular product. And he analyzed it and solved it himself in a matter of minutes. That's innovative self-sufficiency. So development engineering, I just want to kind of circle back to this once more before I start talking about contextual engineering. It focuses on humanitarian engineering and development. Engineers imposing their values, motives, experiences, and knowledge rather than learning from their client. The lack of familiarity is perceived as a deficiency. So if an engineer goes to another society and it's not familiar, they say, oh, well, they're just not as good as us. It happens. And it recognizes and classifies project beneficiaries as the recipients, the client. This whole notion of confidence in alternately developed knowledge is irrelevant. The confidence in the universality of industrialized knowledge reigns. All right, I'm very briefly going to show you a couple of projects that I worked on as an example. This was Manantiales, Dominican Republic. This was a fairly early project I worked on. You can see from the houses, this village was actually abandoned. People owned the land in this village. It was fairly near the Haitian border. A lot of the residents in this village were Haitian or partially Haitian, and because the Dominican Republic and Haiti don't particularly respect each other, this was kind of abandoned for government support. So maybe 10 years before we had gotten there, a German NGO went in and said, you need water, then you'll live in your village. And the people from the village said, no, we need water to irrigate our farm because it's very dry here. And if we can grow more crops in our farm fields, then we can move here. The German NGO says, no, you need water. We'll take care of it. And they built a lovely system. This is a 35,000-gallon reservoir that they built halfway down the mountain to provide storage and support for the village. What's interesting about this is the German NGO left and they never tied it into the water system. So this sat for 10 years unused, absolutely no purpose, but I would bet money that the German NGO had a picture of it on their website or their promotional literature. Culture Bolivia, this was a project I worked on last year with an Engineers Without Borders group from another university. I won't say which one, happened to be Ivy League, I'm not going to mention anything more. This group had come in, they wanted to work with the community on a water system. The community welcomed them in. It was a lovely Quechuan community. Welcomed them in and then said, oh, somebody else is already doing our water system. Why don't you build a bridge? And they said, okay. So they went back and all these water engineers built a bridge. And then they went back to check on that bridge. And when they went back, they said, we're also going to do something that has something to do with water, because damn it, we're water engineers. And so the community was like, okay, I guess you can help us with this channel that we have and align it. And it was chaotic because the project made the community fit their project rather than doing what the community wanted. And it was, I think, a classic case of engineers saying, we know what you really need. It's actually what we want to build. This is way too complex of a drawing, but this is left over from a course that we did last year in Llano Largo, Honduras. I'm just sharing this because I think it's important to see that there's complexity in engineering decision-making with design that we tend not to worry about. This community was built on a mountainside and was relying on a water source that was at about the mid-level of the mountain. And what's happened in recent years is some people have built houses above that water supply and no longer could get water. Well, the houses that were built up higher were the wealthy people. And I don't know if you can see at the very bottom of the picture, there's like a white blob. That's actually their water tap, because this house was able to get water, only it was, down a hill from their house so that the water would flow there. So these guys wanted water. In the middle of the community, there were a lot of homes. There was also the school. A lot of things a lot of things happening there. And they were getting plenty of water for their needs from this spring. There was also a third part. It was a separate community, but it was connected to the same water system called San Antonio, and it was at the very bottom of the hill. Now, this happened to be mostly the poor people. That is not a house, by the way, but it's just kind of a demonstration. The people who lived at the bottom were most in need. They were not the wealthy people. So let me go back here. An engineer could come in here and talk with the community and say, what do you want to do here? The community right away said, well, we actually have 3 water sources. We have our main water source, but there's also another source right at the top of the hill. And a Japanese, this is going to sound like a repetition, a Japanese NGO came in here a while ago and dug a well, and then realized they didn't have electricity to put a pump in. So we have a well at the bottom, we just don't know what to do with it. So it would be really easy for an engineer to say, okay, you've got 3 water sources, you've got 3 levels of community, all in need, let's just give the top houses that extra water source, the middle houses the existing water source, and let's put a pump in the well because there's electricity now and serve the lowest part. But the water in that very top source was heavily contaminated with aluminum. So would the wealthiest people, the decision makers of the community, be satisfied with getting the lowest quality water? The solution at the bottom of the hill with the well, that's great. It was beautiful, pristine water. But to run a pump, it costs money. Who's going to pay the money to run the pump? Is it just going to be the people who use the water? And is that fair that the people who have the least money, the least resources, are the ones that have to pay so that the other guys can get their water source? This is an example where it would be very easy to come up with an engineering solution. But by looking at what's happening with this community societally, it's exceptionally challenging. Make a mistake on how this operates, and you could blow the fabric of this community completely apart. This last one I just wanted to share with you. This is in Senegal. I was also there that was just last year. Wow. Really interesting story where this was a Muslim community. Most men had several wives, and everybody lived in compounds. So you lived in the husband's compound with your co-wives and your children in houses, and you stayed there except when you had to go out to do chores. So the women of this particular community had to walk a long distance to get their water, sometimes spending 6 to 8 hours a day walking back and forth to get their water. And a group came in and said, I've got a solution, we're going to put a well right in town. This isn't it, this is a different town, but this is just an example. Because you'll see in this picture, this was where I was, you'll see women are the only ones who collect water. That's societal, that's the way it is. So the solution was to put a rope pump and a borehole right in town so the women didn't have to walk as long. They installed that, and within a few weeks, the pump was broken. And when they went back and tried to figure out what happened, it turns out the women of the village broke it. Anyone want to guess why? It reduced their walking time, and their walking time was the only chance they had to talk with people outside their rival wives. The only time they had any social opportunity was when they went to get water. And that wasn't considered in the engineering design, and so it was put in a way that was perceived as enhancing their lives economically and socially, and it did exactly the opposite. So what happens with all of these? Well, they were mismatched objectives. The implementing agencies were thinking about development or poverty mitigation. Funding sources were thinking about optimizing investment. The engineer was thinking about modernizing technology, and the recipient, the client, actually just wanted something that worked. So whose objectives win in this situation right now? Well, it's those with power, and usually that's those with money. So as an engineer, how do you get around this? And this is a drawing that I use pretty often. You can't solve this problem based on reading a paper or watching a UN commercial. You have to really understand that fabric of the community, and that's very difficult, especially for somebody who's technically focused, to get a grasp of. But I'm going to give you a sense of what this triangle means. Most of us are aware that there's need in the world, that engineering infrastructure would enhance people's lives. We've seen the commercials, we've talked to people who have traveled, we've heard the stories. A lot of us can attest to it. We've gone places, we've seen it, but we've probably looked at it from our own experience, through a bus window, or maybe we've talked to somebody and then gone back to our hotel, or maybe we've even stayed with the person and kind of giggled about what it's like to be in a house for a night without electricity, you know? But it's until you assimilate, until you're able to spend time with somebody and look at their lives not through your own view screen, but through their perspective. You have to set aside your own values, your own understandings, your own knowledge. That's when you can find the right solution technically. And that's what contextual engineering is. So how do you break this development engineering cycle? Number one, recognize the value of providing resources to rural societies. Don't just focus on the easy solution. Number two, abandon the assumption of uniformity. Scalability is a myth. Number three, clearly identify all stakeholder motivations, objectives, and values. And the reason that I feel that's very important is because if you don't know what's driving you, you can't prevent it from getting in the way of your view of things. I like to travel, I really do. I have to ask myself with every trip I take, am I doing this because it serves a purpose and it has a value, or am I doing this because this is a place I've never been before and I can check it off my book? I have to know that that's something that governs me so that I can work against it. And finally, practice contextual engineering. Okay, so I've been talking about contextual engineering all this time. What is it? It's approaching design from a position of assimilation and humility, laying aside your own knowledge, your own expertise, or your own perception of expertise, and looking really hard at the client's conditions. It's recognizing that an effective infrastructure must consider community need and conditions more than the designer's experience and knowledge. And it's acknowledging that success depends as much upon the designer's adaptation to local conditions as it does on the choice of technology. So, yeah, how do engineers do this? This is a challenge. I'm one. I know how hard it is when you get on the train tracks to solve a problem. To get off of the, well, I'll just do the right math and science. What I've done is created a tool that engineers may use, and we've actually now placed this with Engineers Without Borders USA is offering this tool to all of their incoming projects as of this month. It's a tool, and it's a basic checklist, but the objective is to identify the 5 non-engineering influences that most strongly govern effectiveness of engineering. And those are political, which has nothing to do with elections. Political is talking about power dynamics. Being aware that there are different people that may have different levels of authority and say and respect, and identifying that. There's economic. Again, that doesn't have to do with how much money you've got in a bank account. Economic is what are your needs and how comfortable are you that you can meet your own needs. Cultural, what's your identity? What do you feel you identify with most? Is it a homogeneous identity within your community? Is it kind of diverse, but you have your place? Knowing your cultural identity, knowing that there's a cultural influence is important. Educational is being willing to learn new things, share new things, explore new ideas, evolve, adapt. And technical, well, you'd think that would be an influence, wouldn't you? What that actually evaluates is a predisposition of a community, of a client, to try new things. Do they want to try new things, or are they more comfortable? Do they not have the interest or the desire to explore new technology? Are they more comfortable just staying with what they know? That's the technical influence. This is it, okay, that tool, and that looks really complex. What it consists of, though, is, let me just go on to this. What it consists of is this 41-question questionnaire that asks sometimes really bizarre questions, and we've tested this with about 35 projects so far, all over the world. And it's always very funny to talk with the engineers because initially sometimes they get a little annoyed at trying to figure out how to answer these questions until they figure out why they're being asked, and then it suddenly makes sense. Questions range from things like, do people speak up in public meetings? Do you notice any kind of written record keeping? Are roads paved? Is there upholstered furniture in most homes? How old are the leaders of the community? These are all the sort of questions they ask. And the user has to scale it 1 to 5. That comes back through our website portal to me. We run it through this ridiculously complex algorithm that I'm not even sure how I created. But when I first put it together a couple of years ago, it made sense and it actually seems to work. It's kind of one of those magic things of engineering. But it actually cooks it through a series of calculations based on how important each of these questions are, and tells you which of your 5 influences governs the most. That creates an assignment of influences, and then we give a guideline for design. So how can influences differ from community to community? And I'm guessing that everybody's looking at this right now and saying, well, they all look the same, which is fine, because the reality is these 5 influences are all very strong in every community. The question is the relative influence, which ones rise to the top? And if you look at each of these are 5 examples that I've run. If you look at them, you'll see that one influence, or maybe 2, are a little bit bigger than the others. And that's enough to indicate that those are the things you should really take into consideration with your design. If, for example, if cultural influence is the dominant influence, you better make sure your design isn't going to offend the identity of the community. Perfect example, a Honduran community I worked with that was a Lenca society and a Mayan heritage, took great offense at the idea of putting a concrete catchment over their spring source. And when I asked why, because that's actually in Honduran law for water, all they could tell me was because the snake guards that. And I had to come back and do a little bit of research before we found out that in Lenca tradition, spring sources guarded by snakes are considered the portal to the afterlife. And if you sealed them up with concrete, you're essentially condemning the entire community to walk the earth for all eternity, which, given what they're walking through, may not be that desirable of an outcome. And so if I would have gone forward with what the standard told me and what my knowledge told me, and put a concrete catchment over that spring box, they would have broken it, and that system would have failed very quickly. So very quickly, the conclusions are that context is critical. For engineers, context is critical. You can't come up with a solution and then export it to some other place. Globalization negates this sense of local identity. That's really hard to say. I'm going to try it again. Globalization negates local identity to the degree that when we become comfortable as engineers with saying everybody's trying to reach our status and so we'll give them what we've got, that's just not going to work. Stereotypes can govern over context-based definitions of poverty and food security, so we can feed into those stereotypes of rural societies. They're poor, they're living miserably, they eat only tortillas. That doesn't, for them, indicate the same thing it does for us, and we've got to avoid falling into those stereotypes. Contextual engineering can decrease that power differential between rural and urban by providing respect for rural clients. It can preserve those indigenous identities and knowledge, kind of like ecohydraulics, kind of like the fish in the streams. We can make sure that the right approaches are being applied to the right places. It can address clients' physical needs, and it can promote food security. Thank you. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
How was that three-tiered water solution resolved? I actually hear you say that.
Oh, okay. So the question is, how was that 3-tiered water solution in Honduras resolved? That's an excellent question. Has it been resolved? I'm looking at one of my former students from that project. No, actually what we ended up doing is we created an interlinking system. We worked with the community. They felt very strongly that they wanted that pump to work, and they were willing to have the entire community pay for installing the pump in the well. But we created an interlinked system so that there would be 3 pressure zones, but segments of the community could draw from each other. And working with the community leadership and recognizing that they had a very, very strong community leadership that could manage this, we ended up doing kind of a hybrid of dividing it up, but making sure that they could serve each other. Yes?
I want to start with clarification just to make sure my question makes sense.
Okay. I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Okay,
I just didn't hear you well.
Yeah, no, it's cool. Last showing the relative needs and the
Okay.
hierarchies of those relative needs, like, cultural, not cultural identity, that sort of stuff. I'm really curious about the process as to how that came out. So is it a computer program, an algorithm that you would put certain information into?
Yes. Okay, so the question is, with those pie charts that were in the slide, how did that come to be? And I spent a lot of time looking through research to find others who have considered this, and kind of surprisingly, no one's considered this. So I couldn't find a lot of guidance. There don't seem to be a lot of engineers who have gone beyond the case study in trying to figure out the societal influence upon technical design. And so this has really been formulated over 8 or 10 years of me traveling and talking with others and working with colleagues, some of whom are sitting at your table, who sort of helped me through some of this, in trying to identify these 5 influences. Once we got those developed, we created these questions, and the questions can feed into multiple influences. For example, the one I mentioned on upholstered furniture. That not only gives an indication of economic need, it can be a power differential depending on how much you see and where it's located. If you see a lot of upholstered furniture in a lot of places in the world, it's very difficult to get and even more difficult to keep clean. And so for a lot of rural societies, most people, you'll see most people just using plastic chairs. So that's an indicator of multiple things. After that, how did that create the result? Experimentation. We did some trials. We've had this beta tool out for about 1.5 years now. And admittedly, I can't tell you if it's right, but I can tell you it's a start of the dialogue with the engineers to start exploring how to make it more rigorous. And from what I've seen so far, it's giving a good start. I've interviewed most of the people that have used the tool, and they've said that using the checklist alone made them more aware of societal influences. But then on top of that, once they read the results and the recommendations, they said, yeah, that's right. I've had some people use it retroactively and say, that's why our system didn't work. So it's a work in progress.
So, like, I see a lot of nonprofits take, like, a town hall model of, like, gathering needs, which has its own problems. And then on the other side, there's, like, community organizers who work through conversation. Does the observation, do those questions push a lot of people into conversations, or does, like, how do you find that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So using like the town hall model to explore, or these other techniques to get at some of this information, does this tool push people towards it? The tool pushes, in my experience, the tool pushes engineers into thinking about things more. We don't encourage them to read through the checklist with the client. We ask them to go and get their own perceptions and observations and then fill the tool out. What I've seen happen on trips where I've used it or seen people using it is that people will read it and say, oh, I think I need to look at this now. And then they'll go and look. I'm a little wary of the town hall method of finding out what a community wants because, especially if there's power differences, there's never total homogeneity in a community. There's always going to be disagreement. And when you bring a group of people together and say, okay, everybody, what do you think? Do you guys get along? The person who doesn't isn't going to say no. So this requires more time and more direct interaction with multiple people. And that's something that we encourage with context. To get that assimilative view, you can't just go into town and ask a question and check something off. You have to spend time, you have to look around, you have to ask yourself a lot of questions, and you have to be very observant. Kind of like that art history thing from the beginning. You need to kind of heighten your awareness for yourself so that you can see a lot and think about what it's going to mean. And the tool is like an enhancement to do that. It's an encouragement. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Sorry, I have a follow-up. So, full disclosure, I'm with all this university. So I'm just like, so you do participant observation. And
Uh-huh. Yeah.
and that sort of stuff. So, I'm really curious as to like, I guess when I was in my undergrad, we talked about development a lot. We talked about perhaps a prospective need for government-sponsored like anthropological consultants in areas of development, whatever that may mean for this context. So I'm really curious about that part. Like, would you guys consider adding like a suggestion for an anthropological consultant for a certain specific area?
Yes. So the question of, is there tell me if I'm characterizing this right, is there a role for anthropologists in this process? Is that something that,
A human consultant, because it's like, oh, it's
right.
Whatever someone sees as being a part of a certain thing, that's already a value judgment based off of the discretion of the inputter of that data.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking, okay, so if you get someone who's professionalized inputting this sort of data, it could be very useful to an engineering project in some area.
Yeah, the answer is absolutely yes. There's, I think, a tremendous need. I know with Engineers Without Borders here on campus, and I'm their faculty advisor, they had a particularly problematic project. It was before I arrived, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, and ultimately they brought in some social work students to help them, and that was when they were able to identify what the problem was and resolve it. And I applaud them for recognizing that not all problems can be solved with engineering. We have on our research team, we just brought an anthropology undergrad researcher on with us, and we routinely work with sociologists, economists, atmospheric scientists, urban planners. We do interact a lot with them, and to me that's very important. Again, that goes back to that very first slide. The bit about all knowledge is incomplete. The more that engineers can learn to ask the social scientists, the humanists, for advice, for insight, the more likely the engineers are to come up with a robust solution. Yes?
There are threatened rural communities even in the United States. For example, West Virginia, Southern Illinois. Has someone tried to apply contextual engineering to benefit those areas?
Not that I'm aware of, but it's my hope that we will. Even in more affluent communities in the United States, contextual engineering has a place. What I'm focusing on right now with rural societies in alternately developed world is something that people can see, that it's a very tangible difference. I know when I'm working in Bolivia, I'm not the same as my client. And so it's much easier for me to jump through that lens because I recognize the differences. When I'm working with a community in rural Wisconsin, it's easy for me to say we're all the same because we're following the same regulations, we're subject to the same societal rules, essentially. But those same contextual differences exist, and it's my hope that as this concept progresses, it will move into domestic applications as well. That's actually on my list of research topics. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very, oh, okay.
At the beginning, you were talking, and it was sort of like you were trying to talk about the areas that you're helping. And it reminds me of the whole argument about not calling them lesser developed countries, not calling them third world. There's a scholar that I know that's trying to reclaim third world, saying, we're happy to be third. That means we're not the first, which was U.S. and Europe, but the second to communist bloc. So in a certain way, I refer to this as the overdeveloped world, and in a sense, lesser developed is actually positive in the sense of less war. So I just I know it's an awkward bit of discourse.
It is an awkward bit of discourse because anytime you try to make a comparison, I think you run a risk. I've had challenges with my own students where they've gone to other places And the first thing out of their mouth is, oh, you poor people, what miserable lives you lead. And I've had other students who, they go to other places, and the first thing out of their mouth is, what a joyful life. You're free of all the scheduling stuff, and you don't have all the pressures we do. And yeah, okay, you get diarrhea once a week, and you know, you die when you're 60, but boy, what a great life by comparison. Anytime you're drawing a comparison, I think you put yourself at risk. And that's, I guess, why rather than trying to reclaim, I've just gone to alternate. Does that make sense?
Sure, I just want to.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. All right, thank you very much.